a horror out of history in the long record of human cruelty. Few punishments stand out with the same nightmarish clarity as the method the Greeks call scaphism, more simply, the boats. To even describe it feels like stepping into a grotesque fable, a man trapped between two hollowed vessels, his body smeared with honey, his belly force-fed with milk until sickness overtook him, and his helpless flesh surrendered to the insects of the marsh. It was not death delivered in a stroke, but death stretched thin across days, sometimes even weeks, became less a man than a living corpse devoured by the slow patience of nature. This story is no invention of modern imagination. It appears in the pages of antiquity, passed down by writers who insisted that such horrors were real. But whether this punishment truly existed, or whether it was a slander devised by enemies, is the mystery that shadows our tale. What cannot be denied, however, is the chilling power of the narrative, the execution of Mithridates, a soldier of Persia, who, in the span of a single battle, moved from hero to traitor, from honored servant to the most tortured victim in recorded memory. The year was 401 BCE. The Persian Empire, vast and glittering, stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, a realm where palaces of stone rose from the desert and royal decrees carried the weight of divine command. To the Greeks, this empire was the embodiment of both awe and dread, sophisticated in art and ceremony, yet imagined as ruthless in its punishments. And in this landscape of rivalry and suspicion, the tale of Mithridates was set in motion. It began not with the soldier himself, but with a quarrel between brothers. At the heart of Persia's turmoil lay the death of a king and the bitter struggle for the throne he left behind. The empire had seen dynastic violence before. Tia was the rhythm of monarchies, where succession was never fully secure. Yet this particular conflict would not only end in the clash of armies, but in a punishment so ghastly that it survived as one of antiquity's darkest legends. But before we descend into the gruesome particulars, we must understand the world that gave them shape. To the Persians of the 5th century BCE, the king was no mere ruler. He was the axis of the cosmos, chosen by Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth. His word was not argument, but law, not opinion, but reality itself. To contradict him was to contradict the divine order of the world, and to betray him was to betray the gods themselves. In such a system, the punishment for disobedience was not simply execution, it was a ritual reaffirmation of the king's inviolable authority. Mithridates' fate is therefore more than just a tale of suffering. It is a window into how power functioned in an empire that ruled millions of subjects across countless cultures. Every public act of punishment was a performance, a spectacle meant to terrify, to warn, and to remind. And if scaphism truly existed, it was not merely to kill a man, it was to erase his humanity, to turn him into a grotesque parable of what awaited those who defied the king. The Greeks, who recorded the story, were fascinated by such extremes. They knew Persia as both adversary and patron, employer of mercenaries and rival in politics. To them, Persia's grandeur was inseparable from its alleged cruelty. To imagine the Persians capable of devising a punishment that lasted not minutes, not hours, but weeks, fit neatly into a picture of an empire at once majestic and monstrous. Yet the very excess of the tale's theatrical horror, its detail of insects and rot, makes us ask, was this history, or was it propaganda sharpened into myth? That question will follow us throughout this account. What is certain is that Mithridates was real, and that he fought in a real battle on the plains of Mesopotamia, a battle that decided the throne of Persia. In that battle, he achieved the act that should have secured him eternal honor, and yet, in the cruel arithmetic of power, his deed became the reason for his torment. As we turn to the story of these two royal brothers, Xerxes II, the cautious elder, and Cyrus the younger, Bold and restless, we stepped closer to the moment that would seal Mithridates' destiny. For it was on a battlefield near Babylon, in the dust and clash of Cunaxa, that the spear he cast would change not only the fate of an empire, but his own life forever. The tale we follow is not simply about cruelty, then, but about pride, loyalty, and the cost of truth in a world where truth itself belonged to the king. And as we shall see, the line between hero and victim in ancient Persia could be crossed with nothing more than a single, careless word. Brothers at war, the Persian Empire in turmoil when Darius II, king of Persia, died in 404 BCE. The empire entered a season of uncertainty. His eldest son, Artaxerxes II, inherited the throne, but his claim was shadowed from the start by his younger brother Cyrus, only 22, but already a figure of ambition and restless energy. To the court in Persepolis, this was more than a family quarrel. It was the question of who would control one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. Artaxerxes, cautious and deliberate, was not the sort of ruler who inspired deep loyalty. He was competent, yes, but lacked the charisma that had made earlier kings such as Darius I or Xerxes I seem like living embodiments of divine authority. Conrist radiated vitality as satrap of Lydia and several other provinces in Asia Minor. He commanded wealth and influence. He had cultivated ties with the Greek city-states, a dangerous but shrewd move for the Greeks, though once bitter enemies of Persia, had proven themselves the finest soldiers money could buy. The memory of the Greco-Persian wars still hung heavy on both sides. To the Persians, the Greeks were troublesome provincials at the far edge of their empire, rebellious and unreliable. To the Greeks, Persia was the eternal other, immense, exotic, and corrupt, a power whose wealth tempted, but whose yoke they refused. Yet mercenary service had a way of cutting through cultural hatred. A code from Cyrus's treasuries could silence old grudges. And so, thousands of hardened Greek hoplites agreed to march under his banner, drawn by the promise of pay and plunder. Cyrus was not reckless in his ambitions. He understood the delicate balances that held Persia together, mosaic of languages, religions, and loyalties. The empire stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean in the west. Tentacor province depended on the king's perceived strength. A faltering monarch meant open invitation to rebellion. Cyrus' rebellion, then, was not only against his brother. It was a gamble that the empire itself could be reshaped with him as its new center. But in Persia, kingship was not simply political, it was sacred. The great king ruled by divine mandate. Its authority was the earthly reflection of Asha, the cosmic order upheld by Ahura Mazda. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the gods, and the penalty for such rebellion was not merely death, but dishonor and erasure. In this religious political climate, Cyrus's challenge was more than treason, it was blasphemy. Still, his claim had weight. As a younger son, he had not been heir, but his mother, the formidable queen Parasitis, favored him openly. She believed him more suited to rule than Artaxerxes, whose temperament seemed too mild for empire. Mothers in royal courts were often invisible in official chronicles, but Parasitis' influence was notorious. Her cunning, her manipulations, and her unflinching devotion to Cyrus lent his rebellion a legitimacy that frightened Artaxerxes' supporters. Honor and shame played their roles too. In Persian aristocratic culture, reputation was a currency as real as gold. To be remembered as brave, generous, or victorious meant everything. To be accused of cowardice or treachery was a stain carried by one's descendants. Thus, when Cyrus challenged his brother, many nobles weighed not only political advantage, but also the honor of siding with a daring prince rather than a cautious king. The economic dimension cannot be overlooked. Persia's empire ran on tribute: silver, grain, horses, and soldiers flowed from subject peoples into the royal treasury. Whoever controlled these flows controlled the empire's beating heart. Cyrus had proven in Asia Minor that he could raise armies and wealth with remarkable efficiency. For ambitious governors or satraps, Skaz looked like an investment with potentially higher returns than the established rule of Artaxerxes. The Greeks, for their part, saw Cyrus as a patron who understood their value. Among his mercenaries was Xenophon, who would later record the famous Anabasis, the March of the 10,000, giving us one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts of the ancient world. For these soldiers, the rebellion was less about Persian politics and more about opportunity, the chance to carve out glory in foreign lands. By 401 BCE, both sides had gathered their strength. Artaxerxes II commanded the royal forces, the elite immortals, feared cavalry and provincial troops numbering in the tens of thousands. Cyrus assembled a smaller but formidable army of Persians, allies, and some 14,000 Greek hoplites. The stage was set for one of antiquity's decisive encounters, a clash not merely of brothers, but of two visions of kingship, two claims to legitimacy, and two interpretations of divine favor. What began as a struggle between siblings would soon become a battle etched into history, where loyalty would be tested, ambition would bleed into the dust, and a soldier named Mithridates would unwittingly step into the center of a story that would condemn him to both glory and unimaginable torment. The brothers would meet on the plains near Babylon, at a place called Cunaxa. There, the fate of the empire would be decided. And there, a single spear, hurled in the chaos of battle, would shape the destiny of one man whose name might otherwise have been forgotten. The Battle of Cunxt, two armies met in the heat and dust of Mesopotamia, not far from Babylon, at a place history remembers as Cunaxa. The date was 401 BCE. 4 months, Cyrus had marched his polyglot host down from Asia Minor, weaving through hostile lands, keeping his true intentions hidden until the moment of confrontation could no longer be denied. Now, on the banks of the Euphrates, his gamble had come to its climax. The battlefield was a plain wide enough to accommodate both armies. Stretching beneath a harsh, merciless sun, Artaxerxes had gathered the full majesty of the royal army, cavalry, glittering with scale armor, the elite Persian immortals with their spears and wicker shields, archers, slingers, and levied infantry from every corner of the empire. Ancient sources place his numbers in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians judge them closer to 40 or 50,000. Still, it was an army designed to overwhelm by sheer presence. Cyrus, by contrast, relied on discipline and skill. His greatest strength was his Greek mercenaries, some 10,000 hoplites, heavily armored and drilled in the brutal, methodical rhythm of phalanx warfare. Alongside them marched Asiatic troops loyal to him, cavalry contingents, and Persian followers, who had cast their lot with the younger prince. Smaller in number, but formidable in morale, his army had the dangerous cohesion of soldiers bound not by abstract loyalty, but by pay, pride, and the promise of survival. When the lines were drawn, the Greeks faced Artaxerxes' left flank. Their formation bristled with long spears, shields overlapping, a wall of bronze that even the Persians, for all their numbers, feared to break. Cyrus himself rode at the center of his army, surrounded by 600 cavalry, many of them nobles, bound to him by personal loyalty. His target was not the enemy army in general. It was his brother. Cyrus had gambled everything on the idea that if he struck down Artaxerxes with his own hand, the rest of the royal army would melt away, by their loyalty collapsing with their king. The battle began with a clash of arrows and cries, but soon the Greeks advanced, driving like a spear point into the Persian left. Their discipline was terrifying. Step by step, shield against shield, They pushed, and before long, Artaxerxes' flank was in disarray. Horses balked at the wall of spears, levied troops, broke, and ran. The Greeks would later boast they had lost barely a man in the opening exchange. Meanwhile, at the center, the decisive moment came. Cyrus, reckless in his courage, spurred his cavalry forward. Dust and shouting swallowed the field as he drove straight toward his brother, cutting through bodyguards, striking at the heart of the empire itself. Ancient accounts tell us he was within a spear's length of Artaxerxes, and it happened. From amidst the chaos, a Persian soldier hurled his javelin. His name was Mithridates, a man otherwise lost to history until this instant. The weapon flew true, striking Cyrus beneath the eye. The wound was mortal. The younger brother, who had gambled a kingdom on one charge, fell to the ground. His death was the death of his cause. What followed was confusion. Some of Cyrus' men fought desperately around his fallen body, unwilling to yield the field. Others broke, leaderless. The Greeks, victorious on their own flank, had no idea their patron was already dead. They pressed forward, scattering Persians. Even as the fate of the rebellion was sealed behind them, Artaxerxes, still alive, rallied his men. The great danger had passed. His brother's body was stripped and displayed, proof that the rebellion was over. Yet the cost of the battle was immense. Thousands had fallen, and the empire itself had trembled on the brink of fratricidal collapse. And what of Mithridates? In the immediate aftermath, he was hailed as the man who had saved the king. The javelin he had thrown had preserved the throne of Persia. In any other age, his name might have been inscribed in stone, remembered as the loyal servant who struck down a traitor prince. He was showered with rewards, gifts of gold, honors that marked him as favored by the king. For a brief moment, he stood at the pinnacle of recognition, celebrated as the instrument of divine justice. But already, the subtle machinery of royal propaganda, his fate was being rewritten. For Artaxerxes could not admit that a common soldier, matter how brave, had killed Cyrus to preserve his image as the chosen of Ahura Mazda. It had to be said that he himself had struck the fatal blow. Kingship demanded it. The very fabric of Persian authority required that the king be both victor and executioner. Mithridates' deed, magnificent though it was, became dangerous. The battle of Cunaxa was over, but the real tragedy was only beginning. Mithridates, flushed with pride, would not remain silent about what he had done. In his own words lay the seeds of his undoing. A hero in Dangerin, the days after Cunaxa, the empire tried to steady itself. Artaxerxes had triumphed, his throne preserved, yet his hold on legitimacy was still fragile. He had come within a heartbeat of death, saved only by the chance trajectory of a soldier's spear. To admit that truth was impossible. The great king could not owe his survival to luck or to the hand of a subordinate. His survival had to be divine will, his victory his own deed, and yet Mithridates knew the truth. He had been there, in the heart of the storm, when Cyrus came hurtling forward like a man possessed. He had seen the young prince's eyes blazing with the certainty of kingship, and he had thrown the javelin that ended it all. For that moment of precision and courage, he was briefly celebrated. Rewards came swiftly: gold, fine robes, and a place of honor among the soldiers. The court whispered his name with awe. To strike down the king's rival was no small feat, but Mithridates was not cautious. Flushed with recognition, he spoke too freely. He told the story as he had lived it, how his hand had cast the fatal spear, how he had ended the rebellion in a single stroke. He boasted, perhaps innocently, perhaps arrogantly, repeating the tale until it spread beyond his circle. At first, the story merely added luster to his reputation, yet with each retelling, it grew more dangerous. For in Persia, the truth was not what happened on the battlefield. The truth was what the king declared it to be. Artaxerxes could not permit a tale in which his authority had been secured by another man's hand. To allow that narrative was to diminish his divinely ordained role as a king. If his throne was saved not by his own strength, but by the chance valor of a soldier. The court poets and chroniclers had already begun shaping the official version. It was Artaxerxes himself who had struck Cyrus down, fulfilling the god's justice. To contradict that was no longer an act of pride. It was an act of treason. And treason in the Achaemenid Empire was not simply punished, it was annihilated. The whispers against Mithridates grew. Envious rivals at courtmen who had not been bathed in sudden, glory-stoked suspicion. He speaks as though he were the king, they murmured. He tells the tale as though the empire owed itself to him. Some may have exaggerated his words, twisting boasts into blasphemies. Others may have simply repeated them with the right tone of menace, knowing how paranoia festers in royal ears. Artaxerxes heard, and in hearing, resolved that the soldier who had once been his savior was now a threat. Silence Mithridates with an ordinary death would not suffice. The man had dared to claim, even indirectly, that the great king was not the true victor at Cunaxa. That crime was more than treachery, it was a direct insult to the cosmic order itself. The punishment had to be public, spectacular, unforgettable. It had to serve as a warning to every soldier, every noble, every courtier, that the king alone was the axis of the world. Thus, the sentence was chosen. Scaphism, a word that would echo through centuries as a byword for cruelty. Whether the punishment was truly Persian or embroidered by hostile Greek writers, in this moment it was declared as Mithridates' fate, a punishment not of swords or arrows, but of slow dissolution, body and spirit consumed by the elements, by beasts, by time itself. And so, the man who might have been remembered as the savior of the empire was instead condemned to become its most hideous example. The boats, the Persians, had many ways of killing traitors. Some were swift an arrow to the heart, a sword across the throat. Others were meant to linger in memory, impalement, mutilation, stoning. For Mithridates, condemned not merely as a criminal, but as a threat to the king's glory, something more dreadful was reserved. It was called scaphism. The Greeks, fascinated and horrified, would later record it as the most terrible of deaths. Whether the Persians truly devised it as described, or whether the Greek imagination embellished, the sentence was clear. Mithridates would die slowly, and his death would be a spectacle. The instruments of execution were brought forth, 2 wooden boats, hollowed to fit a man's body. They were laid side by side, then fastened together so that one half covered him from below, the other from above. Only his head, hands, and feet were left exposed, protruding from the seams. Inside, he was trapped alive, immobile, and vulnerable, a man-shaped offering to time and decay. But it was not enough to imprison him. His tormentors began to feed him milk and honey, forcing it down his throat until his belly swelled painfully. More honey was smeared across his face, his arms, his bare feet, until his exposed skin gleamed sticky under the Mesopotamian sun. The sweetness was deliberate. It was bait. For as he lay helpless, the stench of sugar and the heat drew the crawling. Buzzing armies of the marshes, flies, wasps, and ants swarmed to him, settling on his body, drinking from his pores. The boats were then dragged to the edge of a stagnant pond, reeds whispering, water thick with insects. There, set adrift, Mithridates was abandoned to the elements. By day, the sun scorched him. By night, the chill gnawed at his flesh. The milk and honey soured in his gut, and soon the inevitable began. His body, trapped in its coffin of wood, became a living feast for vermin. Ancient writers describe it without flinching, how maggots bred in the folds of his flesh, how the insects burrowed into his eyes, his mouth, the tender parts of his body. He could not move to swat them away, could not wipe the crawling tides from his skin. Each hour was its own eternity. His groans carried across the water, a warning to all who heard. This was no ordinary execution. It was ritual unmaking. By stretching his death across days, perhaps even weeks, the king's justice turned his body into a theater of punishment. Each soldier, each courtier, each slave who heard of it would remember, the great king is the axis of the world, and to challenge him even in speeches to be consumed. No record tells us how long Mithridates endured. Some say 17 days, others less. Time lost its meaning as his flesh rotted while he yet lived, until, at last, the insects and the heat and his own body's corruption finished what the javelin had begun at Cunaxa. And so he died not as savior of Persia, not as hero of the throne, but as a warning carved into human suffering. His name, remembered only through the cruelty of his end, became inseparable from the boats, from the horror of scaphism. A man who might have stood as Persia's loyal champion instead became a ghost whispered about in enemy chronicles, an example of how swiftly glory could turn to ruin under the gaze of a king. Memory and meaning when Mithridates' body at last surrendered to death. The reeds closed around him and the insects scattered. The boats were left adrift, his name already erased from Persian honor. At court, he was no longer spoken of as savior. His DD cast of a javelin that had saved the empire was rewritten into silence. Official poets sang instead of Artaxerxes' divine strength, of the justice of Ahura Mazda, of the king who had smitten his treacherous brother with his own hand. The empire could not afford to remember Mithridates as he was, yet memory has ways of surviving outside palaces. Among soldiers who had marched to Cunaxa, the story lingered. They remembered a man proud of his strike, too proud, who, in his joy, had forgotten the rule that no subject may overshadow a king. They whispered of his punishment, a cautionary tale. Do your duty, yes, but do not claim the fruits of it. In Persia, glory belonged upward, never outward. The Greeks, however, carried the tale in another direction. Xenophon and others, fascinated by both the strangeness of Persian customs and the brutality of their justice, recorded the fate of Mithridates with grim fascination. To them, scaphism was proof of barbarism, a symbol of how despotic kings crushed their own loyal servants to preserve the mask of divinity. His story was preserved not as a warning against pride, but as evidence of tyranny. In the Greek imagination, Mithridates became less a man than a victim, his suffering proof of the moral rot of empire. And yet, between these post-Persian silence and Greek outrage, something of the truth still flickers. His story reminds us of the perilous tension between individual valor and collective authority. He acted with courage, even brilliance, at Cunaxa, but by speaking his truth too loudly, he collided with a system in which truth itself was the king's possession. He became, in the end, not just a soldier, but a symbol of how fragile glory can be, and how easily it turns into ruin when it threatens the structures of power to later ages. His name would resurface now and then, usually in the same breath, as scaphism, the boats, the milk, the honey, the insects. A horror remembered not for who he was, but for what was done to him. Yet, perhaps, in the shadow of that cruelty, we can glimpse the man who was almost immortalized differently, as the soldier who, with a single throw, altered the fate of an empire. His legacy is thus a paradox. To Persia, he was forgotten. To Greece, he was a warning. To us, he is both the savior erased, a victim remembered, a man who reached for glory and instead found eternity in torment. And so ends the tale of Mithridates, hero, boastful, fool, and martyr to the iron logic of kingship. The lesson of Mithridates' history remembers kings. Their names are carved into stone, their deeds preserved in chronicles, their triumphs sung across generations. Soldiers, even brave ones, are most often forgotten, swallowed into the anonymity of the ranks. Yet sometimes a soldier steps out of that anonymity, if only for a heartbeat, and touches the fragile flame of glory. Mithridates was one such man. With his javelin at Cunaxa, he struck down a prince who might have worn the crown of Persia. In that instant, he altered the trajectory of empire. But fate and the machinery of kingship had no place for a savior in the form of a common soldier. His voice, repeating the truth of what he had done, became dangerous. Pride made him visible. Invisibility made him vulnerable. The tragedy of Mithridates lies not only in his gruesome death, but in the irony of his fate. What he achieved was magnificent, but what he claimed was intolerable. He did not understand or refused to accept that. In monarchies of divine right, glory is not earned. It is bestowed, and only from above. His boast was a rebellion as real as Cyrus' charge, and in some ways more unforgivable. Cyrus had challenged Artaxerxes openly, blade to blade. Keith, by telling his story, challenged him after victory, in the realm of memory, which is even harder to control. Scaphism, then, was more than punishment. It was ritualized erasure. His body was consumed slowly, publicly, horrifically, until his name itself seemed unclean. To Greeks, the tale became an emblem of despotism. To Persians, it was not told at all. And to us, centuries later, it survives only as a shadow, a gruesome echo preserved by those outside the empire he had once saved. Yet, if we listen carefully, beyond the buzzing of flies and the silence of censored chronicles, there remains the faint heartbeat of the man himself, the soldier who dared to strike and dared, perhaps foolishly, to speak. His story reminds us that power is not only about victory on the battlefield, but about who controls the narrative after the dust settles. Mithridates' fate warns us of the ancient truth that courage without caution can destroy, that pride can be deadlier than steel, and that the line between hero and victim is drawn not by the deed itself, but by those who tell the story after. And so his name lingers, caught between horror and glory, forgotten by his king, remembered by his enemies. Savior turned spectacle, a man who killed a prince and was killed by a throne. That closes the full arc of the tragedy of Mithridates.